Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live Chat. I'm David Johnson of Transform Ed Consulting. And first of all, I'd like to thank my dear colleague, Cassandra Williams. She is the brains behind Educational Innovation 360 Degrees, and she allows us to use her platform for our live chats. Our guest tonight is Ms. Iris Palmer. Iris Palmer is a senior advisor for higher education and workforce with the Education Policy Program at New America. She is a member of the higher education team and also works closely with the Center on Education and Labor. She provides research and analysis on the ethical use of predictive analytics in higher education, apprenticeship, community colleges, and adults enrolled in higher education. Ms. Palmer previously worked at the National Governors Association, HCM strategist, and the U.S. Department of Education in offices related to higher education. Ms. Palmer earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Goucher College and a Master of Public Policy from George Mason University. Welcome, Iris Palmer.
Thanks, David. I'm happy to be here.
Tell us about yourself. How did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I started out at the U.S. Department of Education, working in the office of what was then the Office of Vocational and Adult Education, and is now the Office of Career and Technical Education. Then I did a tour of the department where I basically went to the Office of Post-Secondary Education. I went to the Office of Policy and the Office of the Undersecretary. And so that pretty much got me addicted to education policy. And from there, I went to the consulting firm HCM Strategist, from there to the National Governors Association, and from there to New America, where I'm very excited to be working on all things higher ed, and particularly community colleges.
Now, of course, you know, I am an educator, and I found it interesting that you did not study education, but instead you studied political science and public policy. So what's the connection between your areas of interest and education?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as a person who studied political science, I came to realize that there's sort of the politics part of political science, and there's the what you actually do in government once you become part of political science. I'm also the daughter of an educator, so I've seen the struggles of being an educator in the K-12 system up close. And it basically occurred to me that I like trying to figure out how to make government work better and organizations and institutions work better. And so that's what connected me to public policy, and education just came naturally because I was at the U.S. Department of Education and learned a ton about it when I was there. So that's the connection for me.
And your connection with, or your interest in higher education and particularly community colleges, how did that come about?
Well, I mentioned that I've been at those offices in the Department of Education that really dealt with post-secondary education in particular. And as I started to get more and more involved in higher education policy, what I found was adults were generally overlooked. And yet one of the main functions of higher education is supposed to be supporting adults and people in the community to reach the kind of career and get the kind of education that they need that maybe they couldn't get straight out of high school. And those people have different needs, and they have different, they need different support, they need different kinds of education. And so I became very interested in how we can structure systems to support adult students, and particularly promote policies at the state and federal level that support these populations.
You know, a general question I have, and maybe it's my own ignorance, is policy. How do we differentiate policy from law?
That's a really good question. So fun. So basically, when you pass a law, you have a lot of wiggle room in the law. There's no way you can address all, and you wouldn't even want to try to address all the ways that the law might be implemented, right? So generally speaking, there has to be different kinds of organizations like colleges or the executive branch that have to actually implement what the law has set out. And that's where policy comes in. That's where regulation comes in. It's where decisions that the executive branch and the colleges make to try to implement the law actually hit the ground and make the difference.
Now, with New America as a non-governmental organization, how do you influence government?
Another really good question. So I see the place where we sit as between sort of research and action. So we like to do our own research on the ground and through publicly available data, but we also translate other people's research from academia, from different places, and we bring it together and we use that to make recommendations for how policy can better support the populations that we care about and that we see as not being served by the system, right? So what we do is try to do that translational piece. So we do a lot of storytelling, for instance. We tend to write in almost like a New York Times like style to try to connect to people that maybe don't know that much about the policy arena, but have influence in it and are interested, generally speaking, in policy more broadly. So that's how we try to have influence. And we also provide technical assistance and things like that to both the legislative and executive branches and people who bring us in to share our expertise.
And how does New America differ from a basic lobbyist?
So basic lobbyists are paid by a client to carry their interests forward in the legislative process, and we are not. We are foundation funded. You can go on our website and see everyone who funds New America, and at the same time, those organizations have no veto power over what we recommend. So we are basing our recommendations on nonpartisan information and research, whereas lobbyists are really stating the case of their clients.
A key word is nonpartisan.
Correct.
So you're focusing on what's best for students and learners as opposed to what's best for a corporation or an organization.
And that's exactly right, David. We put students at the center of everything we do. And while we have a lot of friends in some of the higher education associations, for instance, their job is to advocate on behalf of institutions. And ours, while sometimes those interests overlap with students, sometimes they differ. And we are very clear that we're on the side of students and learners.
Well, Iris, we have 4 big topics here: wide new models of career preparation, quality 9-degree program criteria, what makes a quality program, and going forward. And I think we're going to wind up hopping about and taking the topics as they occur to us. How do you think of this?
That sounds wonderful. I mean, I'm happy to dive in and just talk a little bit about the project and why we think it's important, if that's a good place to start.
Okay, let's start right there then.
All right, perfect. So before actually the pandemic in late 2019, we were approached by a funder that was really interested in figuring out how can we get more people connected to the labor market more quickly, and how can we do that in a quality way? And there were several reasons that they were interested in that question. We want more people to have access to good jobs. We want Black Americans, Latina Americans, Indigenous Americans to have access to jobs and job quality that they haven't necessarily had in the past. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of automation in the economy. And I put this in 2019 because this has changed a lot since 2019. We got our grant in mid-February of 2020. So a month later, everything changed. And if anything, it's really just exacerbated the need for these types of programs and for what quality looks like in these programs. So when we say a non-degree program, which is what we're focused on, we think about it really broadly. It can be non-credit, for credit. It can be an occupational certificate, preparation for an occupational or a license, an industry recognized certification, an apprenticeship, really anything that isn't a degree but is meant to lead directly to a job. And frankly, in the current economic turmoil that we find ourselves in as a result of the pandemic, this is even more important than ever. We see a lot of increased automation. We see a lot of displaced workers. We see a lot of people quitting their jobs and changing jobs. And so we need to have these opportunities and pathways clear for people to be able to re-engage with the economy. And particularly for the populations that have been hit hardest by the pandemic, both health-wise and economic-wise.
Iris, one of your points here is equity. How do you define equity?
Yeah, as far as this project is concerned, we defined equity as really focusing on and helping those populations that have been the most historically discriminated against. And actually at this level of the labor market, that also means women, because women tend to access non-degree programs that leave them more in debt and access much lower paid jobs. So it's both focusing on helping Black, Latino, Latina, and Indigenous communities that have been historically discriminated against and giving them those on-ramps to an economy and to quality jobs that they haven't had in the past. But also helping women get into occupations that they haven't been in before. And I think particularly of manufacturing and IT, which are two like pretty good occupations that have good jobs that you can access with non-degree programs, but are predominantly male and white men, to be perfectly frank.
One of the questions I've always had is the purpose of higher education. Now, I am a proponent and a beneficiary of social mobility, and social mobility comes from being educated for jobs that pay a good wage. But would there not also be other purposes behind higher education?
Oh, there absolutely is. And frankly, we study bachelor's degrees at community colleges. We have other projects that take into account transfer degrees at community colleges and pieces like that. And we would never want a new model of career preparation or a non-degree program to be an endpoint for people. We know, though, like realistically, that a lot of people and a lot of displaced adults in the labor market need on-ramps to jobs quickly. And that's why when you look at the non-degree quality criteria here, we have stackability, because what we would hope is that the colleges and the employers help promote people coming back to college, earning higher level credentials that have more of that, what we would consider like not occupation specific learning and something around citizenship and things like that. These programs generally are very technical and they focus on particular occupations, just as a like what they are. But we would hope people would go on to an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree and get some more of those general education requirements that help them and support them in their growth as people and as citizens.
So stackability means matriculated, I suppose, that the courses add up to a bachelor's degree or even master's degrees, continuing education.
Right. It means that you have a designed ladder that basically you get this program, you do the next set of courses, you get another certification, you get an associate's degree, and then you get like a bachelor's degree and you don't have to start over.
Could you touch on affordability for a moment? I'm thinking of the new presidential administration's emphasis on community colleges, and even the First Lady is a professor at community colleges. And there's some conversation about making community colleges free. Well, there's no such thing as free. Someone's paying for it, but at least free to the student. Regarding equity, is it equitable that community college be at no cost to a student?
Ooh, well, there's a lot. That could be its own episode, David, but I will do my best. First of all, I'd love to say that we are so proud to have Dr. Biden as our First Lady. She did her dissertation on student success at community colleges. It is like my dream. It's amazing. As far as affordability and free community college, I think that the more affordable we can make education for everybody, the better off we are. I don't think that's the end of it. I think we're going to have to continue to work on 4-year degrees, and frankly, people way underestimate the cost of graduate schools. I'm sure you're familiar with. I would say that there's a lot of logistics and implementation issues to be figured out with a free community college program. We are we are, I don't want to say we're close to passing it because Joe Manchin changes his mind a lot, but at this point it would be in reconciliation, and this is the closest I've ever seen it come. So it would be a huge sea change. I think the negative equity consequence might be that it drew more students of color to community colleges who might otherwise go to four-year programs. And I think that we would really have to examine that impact and think about how to create bridges for them to bachelor's degrees, whether that be at the community college they enroll in, or whether we somehow fix transfer, which I don't know how we're going to do that. But so that would be a negative equity implication that I think we should keep an eye on for sure with this. Other than that, though, I think more money for community college students, more money in community colleges, and more support for the infrastructure of these schools is a positive.
Okay. Well, Iris, what should be our next topic here?
Well, let's see. So I can talk a little bit about how we decided to conduct this research.
Okay.
So basically the idea was that we would identify high quality programs at community colleges. And to do that, first we had to decide, what does quality look like? And that's how we came up with these quality criteria. And for us, these are sort of our guiding lights, right? We have labor market outcomes really looks at, do people get a quality job? Do they make a local living wage? Can they control their schedules? Do they have the benefits they need to support a family? Like things like that are what we think about as a job quality labor market outcome. So that's the first and most important guiding light for these types of programs. The equity piece is next, and that's really how does the college and the program address occupational segregation, which, as I mentioned, is very strong at this part of the labor market. The stackability we already discussed. Affordability for this one, it's actually how can you make it as free to the student as possible? Does that mean making it federal financial aid eligible? Does that mean getting it covered by other grants, either at the state or federal level? Does that mean getting the employers to pay for it, in which some of our schools do? And then completion, does it have a reasonable level of completion and or certification and licensure passage as applicable? We know people come in wanting to finish their programs for the most part with these kinds of programs.
I have two questions here, and I hope I remember the second one. But the first one is, in your definition and in your criteria of quality programs, do you include whether the school has so-called wraparound services?
So that's the how, right? So we wanted to find programs that seemed to have the what, like what were the outcomes of these programs? And so these were the criteria we applied. When we went into what makes the quality degree program, the planning, design, and evaluation and continuous improvement phases, wraparound services are mentioned several times in that, because it's how do you create the equitable both completion and admission? How do you guide people through the stackability? How do you connect people to the labor market to ensure that they have good labor market outcomes? So we address that in like the how, like how do you make the good program?
Connecting people with the labor markets. I take it then that you endorse a lot of collaboration between the school and the market, the workforce market. How does policy encourage that type of collaboration?
Well, that is an amazing question, and it's very difficult for policy to encourage that. But there are a couple ways policy can help. One is having a state labor market information system, and also like real-time labor market data provided by the state, usually through some contract with a third party, but providing that data for the colleges to be able to identify where there's demand and which employers are in their circle, so they can work with those employers to validate the data that they get, right? That's a huge policy lever. We undersell it. Another one I would say, providing some kinds of financial aid that employers can take advantage of to train both incumbent and new hire workers, right? So there are these skills funds across states where employers can pay in based on their UI records or things like that. And then they can take money out of that to put their people through some kind of training. And so having those types of programs with the right controls on them can really help support that relationship between the college and the employer. And there's lots of other ways. I won't bore you with them unless you want to go deeper, but
that'll be our next live chat.
Right? Giving colleges money to support subsidizing wages of students employed at some of these places and staff to like develop these relationships is also a really good way to do it.
Thank you. Hopping back to affordability and the question of free college. For our audience, would you describe the so-called last dollar programs?
Absolutely. So currently, we have sort of a set of financial aid programs. Generally speaking, the sort of core of our financial aid programs is the Pell Grant, which goes to low-income students. And generally how state free college programs work is they build on top of the Pell Grant to make sure that there is no tuition to the student. What that means is that there's also no money going to the student to support any kind of living expenses, which many students need to actually be successful at college. So, for instance, the free community college program in Tennessee is last dollar. It makes it much cheaper, and it actually means you're giving more money to richer people who get less Pell Grant. So it's a little backwards, but it's much cheaper for the state, which is why many states do it. I will also point to Indiana and their 21st Century Scholars Program, which is a first dollar program that makes tuition free for those students, and then they get the Pell Grant on top of that for their living expenses, which is a much more progressive way to do it.
Oh, I didn't realize that a first dollar program is more progressive than a last dollar program.
That's how I would explain it. Obviously, there are differences of opinions, but I think if it's a first dollar program, poorer students who get larger Pell Grants can use those Pell Grants to support living expenses, whereas richer students that don't get Pell Grants can support their living expenses in a more expedient way that works for them.
And that's where wraparound services comes into play.
Oh, it comes into play constantly. Like supporting transportation, childcare, housing stipends, emergency grant aid, food. All of these things are incredibly important. Just coaching and advising and mental health services for these students that are juggling so many responsibilities. It's a key for both the equity piece and the completion piece.
Could we jump to one of your other subtopics, evaluation and continuous improvement? Evaluation. Now, I do evaluation. That's one of my areas of expertise. And I think one of the challenges with evaluation is knowing when you walk in what it is you want to accomplish. When you first begin a program, you must ask the question, what is it we want to accomplish here, in order to have a good evaluation so many years down the line. What are your thoughts on how evaluation could and should work?
Yeah, so this is basically, as you're designing the program, you need to think about the metrics of success that you're going to be measuring and how you're going to be measuring those. We are pragmatic enough to know most colleges don't have just data on these things. You probably are going to have to do qualitative data, interviewing students and interviewing graduates and employers to see how your program is performing. So we would recommend a set of measures or goals around things like labor market outcomes, equity, stackability, and then having conversations with students, faculty, and employers to figure out if you're meeting those goals and if the program is still delivering what the employer needs and if it is meeting the expectations of the students as well. We also want to know if students are actually connecting to those wraparound services in these types of programs. I think a lot of times the wraparound services are more for the degree students and maybe less for the non-degree students. And so trying to evaluate how the structural integration of those pieces is incredibly important.
And continuing on the conversation of evaluation and continuous improvement, how do you measure equity? Now, again, this is a just a regular guy talking right now, let's say. And I always think of equity as fair outcomes.
Yes, that's correct.
We have equality and we have equity. Equality, I say that's access. We have equal access. Equity, we all had similar or common outcomes. The outcomes for each of us would be similar, regardless of our backgrounds and our race and all those other isms we use to categorize people. So how does evaluation fit into or fit together with equity?
So I think the most important thing there is to have really clear goals. And what's interesting is the access piece is actually an issue here. You do not have enough Black, Latino students enrolling in some of these programs, and or like the populations that are underserved in your community, because those are obviously very different across the country. Sometimes it's rural, sometimes it's low income, but there are, generally speaking, certain types of programs that maybe have really good labor market outcomes that these students do not enroll in. So you need to have goals and measures for recruiting those types of students to the program itself, right? And then you need to see, are they succeeding at the program? So you want to make sure that the graduation rates and that the success rates are what you would want, and that they're equal across your demographic groups. And then I think it is even more important to look at the labor market outcomes and say, okay, this is how my Black students are performing. They're going into the labor market, they're getting these jobs, and they're performing as well as my white students, for instance. This is just an example. And so if you can measure that and see that, oh no, there's this large gap opening up, and this employer that we work with really closely in creating this program is not hiring our Black graduates, or is hiring our Black graduates with less money, then that is an issue you need to intervene on, and that's what we mean by continuous improvement.
Okay, I understand. Related to that, I know one of your areas of expertise is remediation, and I know that in some states there is little or no support, I should say credit support, college credit support for remediation courses. What are your views on remediation courses and whether students should receive college credit?
So college credit in remediation in and of itself doesn't solve the problem, because all it would be is empty extra credits. It actually needs to count towards a degree in some way. So a couple of thoughts there. One, we actually hear in these non-degree programs that a lot of those programs decide to go on the non-credit side because they do not want to deal with the AccuPlacer, and remediation. So it's a huge problem for a lot of students who are placed into these courses and never succeed. So what I would say is, we should not have standalone remediation anymore. It should all be co-requisite, which basically means that you get help and you go to a sort of support course that gets you caught up while you're enrolled in the college course. And that's a really bold claim. I was skeptical of it, frankly, when it was created as like all remediation is voluntary for students in Florida. But the results have actually been pretty good. And I think we have a lot of converts in the community college system. And I think that the preponderance of evidence at this point is that standalone non-credit remediation is a bridge to nowhere. People do not finish it. They should not graduate. And that it needs to be completely re-engineered into that co-requisite model to be effective.
I really appreciate your insight on that topic. That was very, very powerful. I will keep that in mind in my conversation with others. All right, we have a few minutes left. Where are we going forward?
Yes, I love this. So we are testing our hypotheses that we've created with our cohort of 6 colleges on what makes a high quality program by selecting 6 more colleges that are high quality workforce colleges. We have an RFP right now that is out in the field. Please, if you have any community colleges in your network that you think are good workforce colleges, have them fill out our RFP. It's a $50,000 to the winners of our RFP. And really what they need to do is take our phone calls, facilitate some research, and give us a little bit of data. So we think it's a really good deal, and we're excited to broaden our network of community colleges. Like I said, it is in the field now, and it is due on September 24th. So please get on it. We're excited to like test what we think makes a quality program across multiple programs at a college and think about how colleges become good workforce colleges in a systemic way.
Now, if people wanted to learn more, how could they contact you?
So you can contact me obviously on Twitter and LinkedIn, and they're both there. And you can also contact me at my email address, palmer@newamerica.org.
Great. Our topic tonight was accelerating quality, new models for career preparation at community colleges. Our guest was Iris Palmer. She is a senior advisor with New America. And I'm David Johnson from Transform Ed Consulting. And thanks again to Cassandra Williams for allowing us to use her platform. Thank you all and good night.